Okay, so as you heard, my name is Agnes Gagyi, and I think I was invited here because Andre did an interview with me about my longer trajectory in East European left movements and research on possibilities of East European left movements. But I brought a much less sexy presentation here today because I thought that probably my colleagues will speak about the meanings and how to deal with these things politically and from the human perspective. And I thought that I could just bring some background on these big transitions that are happening now, that are not only about our own transition from socialism to post-socialist neoliberalism, but something bigger that is happening now globally, and then maybe place our own transition within that. So, okay, the region. If you would click through this map through history, then you would see that the borders move all the time. And now, at the moment, too, we are at one of those upheavals again. But if we speak about global capitalism and anti-capitalist possibilities, then this is not only about states and state borders, but it's about how global capitalism as an interconnected system develops and how its dynamics condition what states and political movements can do or cannot do. And this picture, probably some of you know it. It is from Giovanni Arrighi's Long 20th Century. It's one of the big classic works of the World Systems School of Research. World system there only means that you look at social interaction in the unit that the interaction spans. So you don't only look at the household, you don't only look at the region or the nation state. If you speak about capitalism and it has a global span, it is globally interconnected, then you speak about its dynamics within this whole sphere of its organization. So you speak about the world system. And those of you who heard about it probably know that the most things that people usually mention about the World System School is that they have been looking at how different economies occupy their place in the hierarchies of the world system in terms of core, semi-periphery, periphery. But another important thing that they were researching were the historical dynamics through which global capitalism evolved, typically since the long 16th century. And they speak about big hegemonic cycles in that evolution. The first would be the Genoese-Iberian, the second the Dutch, the third the British, and the third the US. And you can see that these cycles are named according to the biggest hegemonic states, but they don't mean that it was the cycle of the US. They mean that it was a global cycle of capitalist organization, which is named after the US because it was the hegemon at the moment. And this graph particularly is just this schematic graph of how capital accumulation works during these cycles. So I will just go through it very quickly because this is not the main point here, it's just background to the background. So where you see the continuous line going up, those are the parts of these cycles when it is the first boom phase of the cycle. Like you imagine the US cycle after 45, after the Second World War. The whole global economy is reorganized according to the new leading industrial forms, which at that moment is Fordism. There are new trade routes, trade agreements, financial system, military system undergirding it, interstate deals, etc. And in this boom phase, it is very profitable lots of capital goes into these new expanding material forms, like for this car industry. And these at the moment are expanding and they are profitable, so even more capital is taken out of the system and then they put it back in. So it is this very beneficial feedback loop until a certain while, and then this part of the cycle is exhausted because the same material forms that this cycle builds out after a while cannot produce as much profit as the investors would like it to be. Like for instance, I just mentioned this example for this car industry. So it is very profitable. The US car industry is expanding. The German is also expanding. The Japanese is also expanding. And after a while, they notice that they just cannot sell that many cars in the global markets. And then this other type of dynamics start to kick in the second part of the cycle. And one of the things that happens is that since material investments are less profitable, capital starts to go into financial markets. This is called financialization. It happened previously too. Probably you heard about these funny stories about investments into tulip buds at the end of the Dutch cycle. It's the same thing. So, you just try to speculate on something else because the real economy is not profitable any longer. And another thing that happens is in our cycle, we call it global neoliberalization, but it also happened in other cycles too, which is reorganizing of the real economy in a way to provide cost cutting in order to keep the profits of capital. So labor's income are going to decrease, middle classes are pressurized, the production is outsourced to cheaper places. In the beginning, so the early phase of this downturn of the hegemonic cycle, can still be beneficial for the core. If we still think of the US cycle, this is like the 90s in the US. They call it jobless growth. Wall Street is flourishing. It is where all the financialized money comes in and is circulating. So it still sort of looks good. The industrial outsourcing compensates for the profits of core companies, like, they put the production into China, but Apple can still be at the top of the value chain. So whatever is being produced for cheap elsewhere, Apple can still maintain its profits. So in the core, it looks like a new rejuvenation. I really called it Bell Epoch, like a beautiful epoch for all these cycles, also the US one. But after a while, this Bell Epoch is also exhausted. And what happens then is that these cost-cutting and compensation mechanisms start not being enough efficient anymore. And this is our age now, when these outsourced industrial chains are starting to break up. There are disturbances in the financial investment because it produces these bubbles, then they crash. And after a while, states are mobilized by their capitalists in order to compensate for their losses, and there is this militarized protectionist competition that starts, which in the previous cycles led to something that they call systemic chaos, which means that basically the whole organism of global capitalism becomes relatively dysfunctional. And so far, it always ended in a war at the scale of the system. And during that war, lots of capacities were distracted. It allowed for new powers to emerge. And then after the wars, as you can see, after that turbulent phase, a new hegemonic cycle, material expansion paradigm can start. And all that capital that was extracted into financial markets previously can be poured back into that phase. Of course, we don't know whether that would be possible now because we are in a climate crisis, because military capacities globally can destroy the Earth several times over. So this is not for granted. This is just description of how it went previously. So if you place East Central Europe into this, so East Central Europe are just the part that I showed you on the map. It doesn't speak about Russia. It speaks about this that historians typically describe as ethnically fragmented borderland contested by regional powers throughout history. Okay, so our development during this big history is first of all marked by both economic and political dependence. So it means that, East European societies and our industrial or technological development didn't define the root of global capitalism. Rather, we were always trying to catch up with other economies that were ahead of us, and the way we connected to them was through subordination. And the same is true politically. If you look at the political development of our nation states, it is always, as historians call them, under hegemonic tutelage of regional and global powers. Like even our first constitutions are written like that, and there is always some kind of checking of what local politics is doing. So in these war systems, distribution of global functions we count as a semi-periphery. This means that we are subordinated to the core, but it also means that we also work as a mediators of global hierarchy, and we actively subordinate peripheries. And then just one thing I wanted to tell you in terms of political ideologies, of the types of political class coalitions that develop in this position, is this other notion of Arrighi that is called developmentalist illusion. This was coined originally in Latin American debates, so in that sense it isn't even about us, but what it means is that you are in this semi-peripheral position. Your own capitalists and political elites always try to formulate some kind of coalition and program that under the given world economic circumstances allow them to prosper as much as they can. And they formulate it in an ideology that promises to the whole country, or at least to their popular allies, to catch up, to raise, to do upward mobility in the world system. And on the long term, this is an illusion in the sense that the world system remains hierarchical. It's very rarely that the top changes, and when that changes, it is because it's an era of a big hegemonic shift. But everybody is always trying to move up, because this is running in one place to how it is running to stay in one place. This is how capitalist competition works on a lower level. So what about our socialist industrialization and post-socialist industrialization in this context? So basically, our story of regime change after socialism, in the global sense, it integrates into what they call the long downturn. This is Robert Brenner's term, the long downturn of the post-45 big capitalist cycle. So after the 70s, it has been going down. It has been doing all these compensatory fixes. And this is where our regime change integrates. So how does it integrate? The first thing to mention here is that even though ideologically state socialism was special, it was one side of the Cold War, it was different from global capitalism in that sense. On the other hand, in its economic practice, it was integrated into the world system through import-export and the values of the products that are set by the external capitalist economy, namely higher technology products have higher value added and they sell for better prices. And your problem as a less developed country is that you keep exchanging lower technology products, typically raw materials and agrarian products, for industrial products of the industrialized West, and you keep losing out because of this. So globally, everybody, not only state socialist countries, but everybody was trying to do import substitution industrialization throughout this stable boom period of the post-war era. And all of these efforts, except in East Asia, which is a different story, I will get back to it, ran into crisis by the late 70s because the conundrum of import substitution industrialization is that you're trying to bring up your own technology level. That takes lots of efforts, centralization of your own resources, subordination of your own agricultural population to industrialization, and we know all that. But still, it's not enough because you have to buy industrial inputs, you have to buy technology from the West, and you have to pay for it in hard currency. So you still have to export something in exchange. You have to maintain a very high level of lower technology exports to the West to be able to pay for the industrial inputs that you're going to use for your own industrialization, and also you have to have still enough resources to do your industrial development. And this was just too much typically for all of these efforts. So they started to take loans in the 70s, which loans were cheap in the 70s because we had the oil crisis and there was lots of cheap petrodollar loans on the world market. But in the 80s, that changed. So there was a shift similar to what is happening now, that in the US, the Fed raised the interest rate of the dollar, which meant that suddenly all the capital that was seeking investment elsewhere preferred to go back to the US because it was better and safer. They were doing this in order to fix the investment problems in the US as its own long downturn. But for everybody else who took all those cheap loans globally, this created a debt crisis. Today, we are in a similar situation too. I will get back to it. So the debt crisis of our socialist economies was the same as the debt crisis of the whole global South at the same moment. And our collective debt crisis was a big fix for the core trying to manage its own problems. And I don't want to go into this narration of how it went for us, because that's more known to everybody, and also it has been described in detail in left critiques of the transition. So there is deindustrialization, which causes big unemployment. It cheapens the local workforce that is going to serve as cheap and flexibilized labor for new reindustrialization that is basically outsourcing of Western production on lower levels of the value chain. So you are compensating for those profits. But this is also part of a global reorganization of the industry. So industrial outsourcing already started in the 60s. So when you had these South European industrial movements in the 70s, that is because they are one stage of this kind of industrial fix. And then after the 80s, the big shift in volume is that from Western industrialized countries, the big outsourcing is to East Asia and increasingly China. And basically everybody else in terms of volume is deindustrializing. So as Eastern Europeans, we didn't like how our industries were killed, and how our 90s and 2000s looked like with the post-industrial debt-led development. That is the same in Argentina, in Ghana, in South Africa, and so on. And just one short mention so we don't skip it. So what is European integration, our European integration in this moment? So in terms of world economic integration, the EU or European Economic Integration Project, it is basically an effort to maintain the position of West European big capital during this long downturn. So the economic community starts during the Marshall Plan, when European capitalism reorganizes in a way that is allied to US Fordism but subordinated to it. And as the long downturn progresses, European integration gets more intensive as European big capital needs more and more insurances and fixes. And you probably know all these critiques of European, they call it neoliberal constitutionalism. So it means that whatever European big capital meant, in the process of institutionalizing European integration, they inscribed it on higher and higher levels where local constituencies cannot question it, or, you cannot vote about the Maastricht Treaty and the limits on the national budget that it entails locally. When Eastern Europe was integrated into this was at a relatively late moment of this process. And those who research European integration from a critical perspective, they call it the high phase of European neoliberalism. So basically, what was symbolically described and even lived by East European politicians as finally becoming part of the European community, in terms of the long economic process, it was a late moment of compensating European capital losses, and Eastern Europe being invited into it as basically a place for the compensation. Okay, and now fast forwards to how we are doing now. So one of the big stories that has been happening all along this story that I'm telling you, but today there is much more discussion about it, is that China, which was the main target of industrial outsourcing, has been upgrading its technological capacities. So you see here that share of global manufacturing value added has been growing spectacularly, and by now it is completely above industries in former core regions. And this has all kinds of consequences. I will get back to it. Another thing that is very much in the news and the political discussions today is that where all that money that China gets for being the industrial workshop of the world's goes into is all kinds of things, but one of them is building out global trade connections and trade infrastructure. And this is a picture of the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a relatively late name and symbolic framework that is given to a process that has been going on anyway. It's not this big plan of the Chinese Communist Party. It is basically a framework where they try to bring together this mostly economic issue. But in terms of, world systems dynamics, the picture is very telling, because these are the routes through which the rise of Western capitalism happened, through taking basically military and then economic control over these routes. And now, in the current conjuncture, these routes are becoming key again. So I will just go through these points to just have a quick summary of these main points of debate here. So one of them is that this bell epoch of our U.S. cycle had its so far biggest financial crash in 2008. And what happened after 2008, and is very significant globally, is that after 2008, China had a huge economic stimulus package. That was the biggest stimulus package in the world, and it had a global impact, partly because it caused a global commodity boom. So all the global south countries were surviving on exporting raw materials and food to China, which then China reworked and exported to other places later. This provided the capacities for more intensive technical upgrading. And also part of the stimulus was that, when you have lots of money and want to cause GDP growth, but the real economy is not growing, then one of the typical things capitalists and states do in such moments is that they do state-led infrastructure development. And China engaged in amazing amounts of infrastructure development. In a few years, it surpassed the amount of concrete poured in the US since the 50s, and it's just huge volumes. And after a while, there was no more local demand for it. So part of the immediate motivations for doing this Belt and Road Initiative, huge infrastructure building across the new trade routes, was just that China had huge capacities for infrastructure building, and they wanted to put it somewhere. Also, during this process, there was a shift in the balance. Maybe you see these maps in the news or political discussions that, I don't know, in 2005, most of the countries globally, their biggest trading partner was the US or someone in Western Europe. And now, for most of them, the biggest trading partner is China. So there is also this kind of shift, which, of course, instigated reactions from core elites. So one of the things that has been brewing since the mid-2010s and came out after COVID as a explicit policy, both in the EU and in the US, is that we want to do industrial policy again, meaning that the state is going to be active in financing and guiding industrial development, unlike in the whole neoliberal era. And this was first initiated by capital groups because they need the help of states to do it. It is also fueling military industry collaborations, just like it used to do in previous similar times. And part of it is about, as you know, today the big topic is about high capacity chips and high technology, IT, AI. So it is about trying to do trade regulations and export regulations and then pushing it on your allies to accept and implement those regulations in order to try to keep China from developing as far as it does technologically. Why? Because your own high-tech industries are already starting to lose out. It's not a beneficial collaboration with the Chinese manufacturing any longer because they are catching up too fast. So that is one of the things that is happening. And this geostrategic decoupling is part of it, but it's also very much about state politics and state geopolitics and military geopolitics and its geographies, as I showed on those trade routes that are key and have been key ever since. In practice, you probably hear these debates how this geostrategic decoupling sounds. So it sounds like this, that, oh, you are Europe, you are producing cars. Well, we don't want any cars that have Chinese parts in it. China doesn't want any parts that have US parts in it. And the rest of the globe wants cars that they don't care what is in it, but they want it cheap. So if you're a European manufacturer, you start to have 3 lines of production, and everybody else is trying to do the same. And meanwhile, everybody is trying to mobilize the leadership of their allies to implement changes that are more beneficial to them and their capital groups than others. And then there is another stream of events that you know that are infecting this, and that is in terms of global economic effects. One of the main effects of Russia's war in Ukraine is that there is an energy crisis. This is not only Europe's energy crisis because Russian gas is not coming, but it's also everybody else's energy crisis because rich Europe is buying up LNG, liquefied natural gas. So everywhere else in poorer countries, you have a secondary energy crisis. And the global sanctions that were announced because of Russia's war in Ukraine, for many other economies, they are key to their survival. So there are these debates wherever you go, like India, Brazil, South Africa, other African countries that are not willing to join the sanctions, but they are required to. So even if you don't want to, just because your economies are so much connected to these flows, you start to be an active player in this geostrategic game. And one of the new keywords that is coming up because of this is non-alignment. So we know non-alignment from the Cold War era. It was mostly a global south project that was critical of capitalist development. But this new non-alignment movement is rather about capital groups and national elites of third countries who are not winning by taking either one or the other position in the new Cold War, trying to work up some other strategy within their own orientation, but also with very intensive networking and new agreements with potential partners. And then there is green transition. This is key to surviving the climate crisis, but the way it is happening in practice is very much determined by the position and dynamics of actors within this crisis that I was describing. Namely, at the moment, green transition is mostly working as a means for industrial policy that is helping locally dominant capital groups to survive their own part of the crisis and prepare for later market opportunities. And mostly for Daniela Gabor has been writing on this. Those who don't follow her work, I suggest you do, because it's really eye-opening and very up-to-date. So she calls it capital de-risking, the green transition policies in both in Europe, in the US, and in global forums like IMF or World Bank, because it is mobilizing state money or state backing in order to ensure private investors that no matter what, their green investments are going to be profitable. This means that they are happening in a way that is, of course, not necessarily ecological. They are only happening where it is guaranteed that it's going to be profitable. And the same asset managers who are also started to choose these de-risked green investment packages, meanwhile, are not deterred from also using fossil investments. So all the empirical data shows that green investment is growing, but fossil investment is also growing at the moment. And this connects to the new global debt crisis. So during COVID, and all the other crisis effects of, supply chain breakdown and everything, everybody was encouraged to take loans. The global south, poor countries especially, took loans. And now there is a new debt crisis looming with the same triggering effect that the Fed raised the interest rate of the dollar. And in this moment, the global reparation packages are bundled together with this green transition de-risking in a way that's saying that the IMF says that we can bail you out only if you are going to do these and these green transition policies, which in practice mean the privatization of the energy and other industrial capacities or even natural resources of these countries. And they also mean that local people and local workers have no say over it. And we are seeing this new wave of global mobilizing against these effects. And then just to come a bit closer to us, this I will keep much shorter. So in Europe, we have this industrial connection problem that most of European big industry has been also outsourcing to China and also turning toward Chinese markets since 2008. Now they are pushed to decouple. It's a very uncomfortable break. We can see that in the incoherent communication of what does Leyen say, what does Macron say, and so on. Meanwhile, whole of Europe was encouraged to take loans during COVID. And now in Europe, the new austerity principle was announced just like after 2008, except military spending, which is expected to grow because of the war situation. And our region within that is in a more subordinated and more uncomfortable position because we are on the geopolitical front line, which in itself brings lots of problems. Plus, we have been the receivers of a new wave of reindustrialization after 2008, where particularly these two threads of Eastern and Western investments were connecting. Like I come from Hungary. In the last 4 years, Hungary became the third biggest accumulator maker in the world because of all the East Asian, including Chinese investments into building the whole car battery production chain in Hungary, which they are doing because of their collaboration with German car makers, Volkswagen, BMW, and so on. And Hungary is the assembly site where this is put together. And Hungary's economy is dependent on this being able to go forward, and the whole of it rests on Russian energy. So as a side of this secondary or tertiary externalized reindustrialization, you are also economically more at risk. And then for the last 7 minutes, I just want to say something positive. That was the subtitle about social power in the title. It is not about Eastern Europe, it is about the global south, but the main idea is just to show a perspective on where on earth we can stand in this when we are neither industrialists nor political leaders or asset managers. And there is no position offered for simple people on in the current discussions on how to solve these global crises. So in the picture, this is just the anecdote part. The first one with those taxis, they are called jeepneys. Probably you know them, made out of former US military cars, and in the Philippines and in other places too, they are used for this individual entrepreneurship as taxis. And with this energy crisis of that I mentioned, that Europe was buying all the LNG, these people got into problems. And this is somewhat similar to the previous story that you probably remember about the yellow vests in France, when in an elitist move of climate politics, they raised taxes on car fuel, and that ruined the life of many people who were depending on cheap gas to commute for work. So people started to step up against it, and then there was this seemingly unsolvable problem that either you are with the people or you are with the climate. And many climate movements tried to solve this issue, but they couldn't in the end. And in this case, with the jeepney drivers, they were organized by one of the trade union federations there to step up as a collective agent and demand the state not only to help them with temporary money or fuel exemptions or something, but they came up with a program that they want, for which they want help in order to upgrade into electronic cars. And the second image is one site where TUED, the trade unions for energy democracy global alliance, is active in Africa, and they are doing part of the work that I mentioned, where trade unionists try to take a place in the debate that is about how to do the green transition in their countries. And one of the advanced examples of this situation is the case of Eskom in South Africa. I don't know if you heard about it. That is the national energy provider. And during the last years, it has gotten into such a crisis that it started to do load shedding, which means that you just shut off energy provision for many hours for big neighborhoods or whole regions of the country. And they have been doing it in a way that I would imagine it would happen in my country, Hungary, that, you keep providing for the important industries and you don't provide for the not important poor neighborhoods. So Eskom and other energy trade unions in South Africa have been organizing to step up against this and not only strike or resist it, but also actively promote a program that is their own program on how to keep the existing system running, how to upgrade it in a way that doesn't serve big industrial capitalists, but serves the provision for the people, and also how to rework its big framework of funding and how it relates to the state in order to make it sustainable. So just something on the framework of how this is happening. So what were the political ideas on how to put social interests into the green transition? One of the big ideas, as you probably know, was the Green New Deal, the social Green New Deal, where the idea was that you put public investment into infrastructure transition, but not in a way that de-risks and compensates private capital, but that helps the new sustainable infrastructure to shift under social and public control. And you also provide jobs through this. And this was the big idea of the Green New Deal project in the beginning, that you are going to gain votes if you promote this to the people, because it would provide jobs. In the end, as we know, the way these Green New Deal policies went through the existing political system was that they were grinded down to the ground, because even though some people voted for it, and even though the projects themselves, the papers were shifted from Ocasio-Cortez to Sanders to Biden, by the time the policy happens, it goes through the lobbies that represent the real powers in the real economy. And since workers do not have an organized power in the real economy, the only powers that were sitting there were the ones who created the existing Green New Deal packages as they are. So the framework on how unions are part of this officially, in terms of the International Trade Union Federation, is just transition. Just transition meaning that okay, workers, unions, we won't resist these changes, which might mean that we lose our jobs, on the condition that we get new, decent jobs in the green growth. And the problem with this project is that the idea is that there is going to be green growth that will be big enough, and that it is going to produce enough decent jobs. I mean, as we know, for instance, one of the big industries that is growing is the solar, and solar industry is completely famous for having horrible working conditions. So this trade unions for energy democracy is a global alliance that has been mobilizing to add something to this because they thought it's not enough, and they call it social power. Basically, they say that now in the climate crisis, there has to be a new role for trade unions. It's not only about workplace bargaining, it is about the majority of the global population who are just workers trying to do something to influence the direction the climate transition goals, because they have a position within the fossil economy. They have a capacity that if they are organized, they can have some kind of economic power. They have the capacity to technically think about how to do it in another way, because they are the ones who are running it. See the example of the South African energy trade union. And this is a way that simple people could address the infrastructural scale of the climate transition. So if we only think in movements, we are either just constituencies who are demonstrating or are voting for someone, or we are individual activists who try to not consume plastic wrappings. But in order to address the large macro scale of the infrastructural change that is needed, you need some kind of organization that is on that level. And the idea is that trade unions are on that level. And of course, not everybody is a wage worker, and life exists outside of the workplace for the same worker, like they have to go to the kindergarten and to the hospital and have to live in a house. So the idea is that you need to combine this with building reproductive capacity. So the way TUED also works is that they would organize a strike to stop national energy company from being privatized. Through that strike, they push the alternative agenda on what has to be done. And in that agenda, they always push for increasing community and the public areas of the economy. And I just put social movement unionism into that because that is this long-term movement name of how you organize within the reproductive sphere, like housing movements or ecological movements, together with trade unions, which are different in terms of how you name it, but in terms of people and families, they are not different. And this has always been the case in the workers' movement, but this is just one way to call it. And I am finished. Sorry for the few extra minutes. I will just leave this here so you see how they speak these movements. Thank you.